Welcome to your third lecture. We'll be talking about histology, which is going to be the study of tissues. Remember, ology just means study of, and hist is going to be referring to tissues. So we are going to answer the question. So we know that cells make up tissues. What do tissues make? When we are looking at these slides of various types of tissues, which are just groupings of cells, sometimes there's different types of cells that make up different types of tissues. So multiple types of cells, multiple types of tissues on one slide, and we'll kind of point that out as we go. But I want you to think of this scene from this movie, if you're familiar with it, where we are just enhancing. So if we were looking at a slide from a bit of skin, just think of zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. You keep zooming in until you can see those individual cells, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. Sometimes it's hard to conceptualize what exactly we're looking at, and this is the best way I can do it. So there are 4 types of tissues that I want you to know that we'll be covering in this section. Do know that cells perform a common function when they're together, and that's what makes up a tissue. The first type that we're going to cover is epithelial tissue. I do want you to know that this is going to cover body surfaces and lined body cavities, and we'll talk about the next 3 coming up here. So again, epithelial tissue. The functions are that they provide physical protection, control permeability, provide sensation, and produce specialized secretions. So what I want you to know about epithelial tissue is what it is, where you'll find it, and kind of its purpose, like why is it there? So the what is they are tightly packed cells that form a continuous layer, sometimes multiple layers. Where you will find it is in skin. It makes up skin, various organs, surrounds blood vessels, and you also find it just throughout the body in general. Another place I want you to state is glands. You will also find epithelial tissue makes up glands. So this is where they have those secretions. Glands will secrete hormones and various other secretions, but that is made up of epithelial tissue. So their purpose is for protection. Think about your skin is a barrier protecting you from your external environment, also keeping your internal environment internal. The other purpose of epithelial tissue is secretions, absorption, excretion, and filtration. So epithelial tissue is going to be classified by the number of layers as well as by the shape of the cell itself. Now, these 2 terms, simple and stratified, are kind of in relation to each other. Simple is going to be 1 single layer, while stratified means 2 or more layers. These 3 terms underneath there are going to refer to the shape of the cell. Squamous, you can think of as just squashed. Cuboidal, as the term implies, is that the cell shape is going to be cubed. And columnar, they're going to be like columns. And within columnar, we have a term called pseudostratified. So this term here, pseudo, is going to mean fake. And then we know that stratified means layers. So what this means is that it is just fake layers. And we see an example here in this chart. So the way that the cells are placed is kind of irregularly shaped. And then you can see the nucleus for each cell is kind of in a different spot along this layer, which is just one layer. So it looks like there could be multiple layers, like here's a layer kind of splitting down the middle, but that is not the case with pseudostratified. This is a single layer, and normally with pseudostratified you're going to have these structures right here, which are called cilia, which we will talk about when we talk about this specific type of epithelial tissue a little bit later, but a little bit of pre-knowledge there. So for each type of epithelial tissue, I do want you to know the location and kind of a basic function. More specifically, I want you to know what it looks like, but as well as like a location. And in general, know that epithelial tissue is going to have these various functions, and just know the location is kind of the more important thing. So here we have simple squamous. So our cells are going to be nice and squished. You're going to find them in the kidneys, lungs, and lining of blood vessels. I really like this slide. This is from the lung. And you have these big spaces that is surrounded by a single layer of cells. So that is what that purple is, that is outlining these structures here. That is just a single layer of cells, and you can see the little nuclei, the little darker portions, but this is just an empty space here. And we can see that that is an empty space. We can see that the cells are along the edge. This is also an example of simple squamous epithelial tissue down here. I like this graphic here, but chances are if I show you a slide, it will be something like this. Next up, we have stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So everything in this red up here is going to be epithelial tissue, so just keep that in mind as we go. There are two types of stratified squamous, which remember stratified just means layers. So it's just layers of squished epithelial cells. There are two types that we want to talk about, and that is keratinized versus non-keratinized. Keratinized stratified squamous epithelial cells are going to resist friction and repel bacteria. And you're going to find these cells in the epidermal layer of your skin. So that is going to be that topmost layer of skin. It's the layer that you can physically see with your eyes. It's the layer that you can touch. It's the layer that covers your whole body. On the outside, it's external. Non-keratinized stratified squamous cells are going to retain moisture, and these are going to be tissue that you find with your tongue, within your mouth, esophagus, and in the vagina as well. And you can see from this picture down here that we have kind of squished cells pushed together, as well as multiple layers. Now this slide shows it a little bit better. Up here we have a slide from the vagina, and this is going to be our stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So just know what that is going to look like based on these slides and where you will find them. Next we have simple cuboidal. I find these to be really cute little cubes of cells. They're adorable. You're going to find these in the kidneys, the pancreas, glands, including the mammary and the salivary glands. The mammary glands are going to be located in the breast. Salivary glands are going to produce saliva, and you'll find them here, here, and under your tongue. And the functions are for secretion and absorption. And I am covering this little section here that is going to be found in a nephron within the kidneys. And then I really love this picture here. If I'm going to use any picture, it's going to be this guy. But you can see this single layer of cells. I'll just kind of outline it here for you. And they're just these perfect little squares, little cubes. Now there's a term here I do want you to know. You can kind of ignore that. Specifically the lumen. So that is this empty space right here. So this is, if you had a cylinder, it's the middle, if the middle was hollow. So that is called the lumen. It's just an open space. Next up we have stratified cuboidal. So this is going to be much like the last one, but it is going to be layers of cube epithelial cells. So you will find this in the ducts of adult sweat glands and will make up the male urethra. So that is where urine is going to pass from the bladder to the outside of the body. The function is for protection, secretion, and absorption. And then I do like this picture more than anything. This is from the esophagus, but you have the lumen here, so that empty space, and then you have those multiple layers of cube-shaped cells. Probably one of my favorite types of epithelial tissue is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is going to be in organs that are subject to expansion from within. The best example I can give you is the bladder, and the function is to protect that organ. So what's really interesting, and I will use pictures like this, I'll give you both pictures and tell you what you're looking at. So this is a slide of relaxed transitional epithelium, and then this is what it looks like stretched. So if you think about the bladder, when you don't have to pee, it's going to be kind of small. I believe it's about the size of a walnut, thereabouts. A little bit smaller in females because of the placement of the uterus, but regardless, we'll get to that. So the bladder itself is going to be kind of small when there's no urine in it. As urine becomes filtered from the kidneys and the bladder starts filling up, that little bladder is going to start to expand, kind of like a balloon. Well, you have to have this way of the cells sitting with each other in kind of a tight junction, so that when they're relaxed, they kind of overlap each other in a way. They kind of crisscross and overlap, and you can see that with the nuclei there. And as that organ and those tissues expand, you can see that it becomes much more stretched and tight. So those nuclei are now no longer sitting on top of each other, but next to each other. And this is just another little explanation of that and showing that as well. Next up is simple columnar. These may contain microvilli and cilia. We talked about those a little bit before. You're going to find simple columnar epithelium in the digestive, respiratory, and reproductive, and urinary tract. The functions are for absorption and secretion. So remember, this is just a single layer of column-shaped cells. You can also see the difference in this kind of compared to the pseudostratified, because the cells are going to line up pretty well. They might not be perfectly lined up, but for the most part they stay in a pretty good line. And here's another lovely picture. So pseudostratified columnar, remember this just means fake layers. And you're going to notice that they contain cilia, so these little hairs on the top, and goblet cells. Probably the coolest thing. I really love these, and I love the name for them as well. So when it comes to goblet cells, they are going to contain mucus. Mucus is going to be within goblet cells, so if you want to think of it in kind of a gross way to remember it, pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue will contain little goblets of mucus. And the reason being is that the location such as the respiratory tract, specifically we'll talk about, and I'll tell you what the epididymis is here in a second. The respiratory tract, so somewhere in the throat, you're going to have this lining of cells. Now, this space is going to be your throat. As you breathe, anytime, anywhere pretty much, you are going to be breathing in debris, possibly bacteria, maybe it's food particles or something of that nature, dust, who knows. As you breathe in debris, this mucus is going to catch the debris. As this sticky mucus is catching debris, the cilia are going to be moving that debris within the mucus up and out. So that's going to be like phlegm when you cough it up in the morning, or most of the time you probably swallow that product. But just know that that is the purpose of those goblet cells. And then the epididymis is going to be the structure within the male reproductive organs. We will talk about that a little bit more later, but it is a structure located in the testes. We will talk about that more later. I want you to more focus on the respiratory tract for now. So just to go with all of that, the function of pseudostratified columnar is secretion, and I'm sorry that's kind of cut off, but it does say movement. Here we have another nice picture of that pseudostratified columnar cells, and then you can also see mucus in these goblet cells, which are kind of cute and interesting. And I like this graphic a little better because it's showing that a little bit more, a little bit of mucus that's going to get secreted out into the lumen. And then you can also see them here in an actual slide. So here we have a stratified columnar, so layers, actual layers of columnar cells. You're going to find these in the lining of the urethra, ducts of some glands, and then in the anal mucous membrane. And the function is for secretion and protection. And then here we have these lovely slides. So, when you think of epithelial tissue, I want you to think of skin. That is the first thing I want you to think of. We will be talking about the integumentary system here in a little bit. I believe it is the next lecture, so we will be talking about that soon. So moving right on to our next type of tissue, it is connective tissue, and the purpose is to bind and support body parts. What's really interesting about connective tissue is that it is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue. The cells are not in direct contact with one another, so unlike epithelial tissue, they're not quite as closely junctioned. They can be more spread apart. And most have a rich blood supply and nerve supply. The function of connective tissue is going to establish a structural framework from the body, transport fluids and dissolved materials, protect delicate organs, support, surround, and interconnect other types of tissues, store energy, defend the body from invading microorganisms, and I'm sure we could probably add a few more on there, but those are the ones I want you to know. So here are the divisions of connective tissue. So let's start with the types of connective tissue first. So we have loose connective tissue, which is going to include these types. So this is sort of like a section, and then we have some subsections. But I want you to know everything. So of the loose connective tissue, we have areolar, adipose, and reticular. The next section we have is dense connective tissue. Within that, we have dense fibrous connective tissue. That's going to include dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Next, we're going to have the fluid connective tissue, which is going to be blood. And then you have two supporting connective tissues. I'm so sorry. This is kind of phrased incorrectly because this should be here and this should be here. So just ignore these for the moment. That's just a little error on my part. So blood is your connective tissue, and the supporting connective tissues are going to be bone and cartilage. And I do want you to know that when it comes to cartilage, there's going to be 3 types. We'll talk about them. So let's talk about connective tissue, specifically loose connective tissue. It's going to connect the epithelia, so the type of tissue we were talking about before, epithelial tissue to underlying tissue. So the way that your skin is you have epithelial tissue on the top, and then you're going to have connective tissue that's going to connect it lower, deeper. Okay? We are going to hold organs in place. It's going to be the padding under your skin. This is going to be like fat. It will degrade with age, as well as exposure to sunlight, if you smoke, and all of that means wrinkles. So as you get older, various spots on your face may start to sag. You may get the wrinkles at the corners of the eye, maybe along the mouth, forehead, wherever else, but this just means wrinkles because you cannot maintain this connective tissue the way that it is. In fact, if you want to, you can take your hand right now, put it out, and go ahead and pinch up the skin. Don't do it too hard, don't hurt yourself, but if you let it go, it should go back to the way that it was before, and that is because of this connective tissue, this loose connective tissue. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is how stretch marks are associated with this loose connective tissue, as well as scars. But this occurs when the tissue is damaged. So that can mean that the tissue was stretched too far, there was a cut or some type of wound that went too deep that damaged below the epithelial tissue. It just depends, and we'll talk about scars a little bit more in the integumentary system. All right, so moving on to our first loose connective tissue, which is areolar, it is going to look like this picture here. There are various things within areolar tissue, such as collagen fibers. You maybe have heard of collagen. A lot of products for your face or sometimes in drinks contain collagen, and honestly, I don't see any benefit to drinking collagen, and it can't really be absorbed through your skin, so just be careful that you're not buying snake oil when you're getting things that have collagen in them. There are a couple other things in here. We have macrophages, and macrophages are going to be just cells that are going to eat other cells, but this is usually a good thing. Typically, it's going to be a type of white blood cell, which is going to be part of your immune system. There's a few other things in here. I'm not going to ask you to know them, though. I just want you to be able to tell me that this is areolar tissue. You're going to find this under your skin, around blood vessels and organs, in between your muscles. So again, that little exercise I showed you before, when you lifted up your skin and let it go back and it went flat, is going to be what this is areolar tissue. Next up, kind of an interesting, fun one, I like the way that these look, is adipose. And what I want you to know about adipose is that it is fat. And we need fat. It's very important for our bodies to have some type of fat deposit, both for energy and protection. It's very important, very good for you, and of course in moderation. Everyone has it, we need it. If you don't have any fat, that's probably not a good thing. It is going to store energy, as I said. It's going to protect, insulate, and connect various other tissues. Now, the way that adipose tissue it looks, so first of all, this is an adipocyte. Oop. Which just means fat cell. So the way it looks, it almost looks like simple squamous epithelial tissue. Don't get them confused. So these are going to be like big pillows or marshmallows. That's the way they look to me. And you're going to see these darker structures at the corners. So that is the nucleus that's going to be at the corner instead of simple squamous, which is going to be very distinct little structures kind of going back and forth like this. It looks slightly different, but they could get confused for each other. Just don't confuse them. Next is reticular loose connective tissue. This is a network of reticular fibers and reticular cells. It contains something called reticulin, which is just a mesh network. But what I want you to know is that it's supportive for the liver, the lymphatic organs, your lymph nodes, spleen, and thymus. So this is part of the lymphatic system right here. So just know that, and that it looks like this. It looks kind of eerie, almost kind of like an Art Nouveau type of design. Next up, we are going to have our dense fibrous connective tissue, regular versus irregular. First is dense regular, which is going to be collagen fibers that run parallel to each other. So you can see that here. They're just running along with each other. They're going to have strength along the axis of the fiber. And the example I want you to think of is tendons and ligaments. Now, if you are a sporty type person, potentially, hopefully you don't, know what a torn ligament or a torn tendon is. I hope none of you have ever experienced it. I've heard they're quite painful, and once it's damaged, it's hard to repair because there's not a whole lot of blood supply going to these areas. Now, the way that they tear is that if everything's going in the same direction and then suddenly this guy goes like this, because maybe your foot or your ankle twist or maybe your knee twist, but things aren't running parallel anymore and suddenly something's going the wrong way, it's going to tear. Next we have dense irregular, dense fibrous connective tissue. That's technically the full title of it. And this is where you have random collagen orientation, and it's going to have strength in multiple directions. An example is going to be the dermis of the skin. So if the layer that you can see on the top of your skin is the epidermis, below that is going to be the dermis. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the integumentary system, but here is a nice slide of that. Everything in this darker pink is the epidermis, and then everything below that is going to be the dermis. Now I do want you to know the difference between these two types of tissues. I want you to know that dense is going to run parallel with each other, the collagen fibers, and dense irregular is a random collagen orientation. And do know what they look like with these slides. Next up is elastic dense fibrous connective tissue. It is more elastic fibers than collagen, so it's going to allow for the structure that it makes up to stretch. It's springy and resilient. It's found between your vertebrae, in the walls of large blood vessels, and I think the most interesting, it is located in the erectile tissue of the penis, which is called the tunica albuginea. So if we're looking at this structure right here, this guy, what we are looking at is a cross-section of a penis. So this is going to be the urethra, so the opening of the penis, and then the erectile tissue is going to be surrounding all of this. So that is going to be tissue that allows for expansion due to the nature of erections and the fact that the penis is a hydrostatic organ that allows for blood to fill it. This type of tissue is going to allow for the penis to expand. kind of cool. Next up, speaking of blood, we have our fluid connective tissue, and that is blood. It is a liquid matrix. It is going to serve the purpose of transporting oxygen and nutrients, as well as carrying away waste, such as carbon dioxide. So if you want to, just make sure you know that that waste is going to be CO2. I do want you to know the difference between red blood cells and white blood cells, and also know that this is going to contain platelets, but I'm not going to ask you to point those out. Now, the vast majority of your blood is going to be made up of, between red blood cells and white blood cells, that is, it's going to be red blood cells. So if you're looking at a slide like this, you're going to see quite a few little discs like these. These are your red blood cells. Which means these big purple ones, which are all different types of white blood cells. These are mostly the same, but we'll talk about those later. These are white blood cells. So make sure you know the difference between the red blood cells and the white blood cells. Not sure why this one's popping up again. My apologies. So here we are talking about a supporting connective tissue, and that is going to be cartilage. I told you there would be 3 types. These are them. We are going to talk about them next. So the matrix, I should say matrix, sorry for all the errors guys, my apologies, is a firm gel. They are going to contain something called chondrocytes. So this term here, and this is just going to be cartilage cells. They'll be located within something called lacunae, and that translates into little lake of space, which I think is probably one of the cutest anatomical terms that is used. So what you're going to have within the matrix, so if all of this is the matrix, which is that gel, you're going to have little structures that are just little lakes of space. Within those little lakes of space, you're going to have your chondrocytes. So within the lacunae, if I can get these little lines to stay, within the lacunae, you're going to have your chondrocytes. So your chondrocytes are what's in purple. Then you have your little lakes of space, lacunae. You're going to find that cartilage makes up your ears and your nose, so you can actually feel the separation of your cartilage from the bone, your nasal bone up here. Usually there's a little dip. You can also test from the side, so where it becomes the part that you can kind of move, that's going to be your connective tissue. Your cartilage, which is a type of connective tissue. You're also going to find this in your joints, and I do want you to know that there are no blood vessels. This means that cartilage does not heal well. So the first type of cartilage I want you to know is hyaline cartilage. This is going to be made up of collagen fibers in a clear matrix, and they're relatively spread apart. Now, these little white spaces that you can see up here are your lacunae. The little purple inside there is going to be your chondrocyte. So make sure you know that. You will find these at the ends of bones, your ribs. It's going to make up the fetal skeleton as well as your trachea, which is going to be the start of your respiratory tract. So from your mouth to your lungs, that's your trachea. The next type of connective tissue is going to be elastic cartilage. So that's next here. Sorry for all these pictures kind of covering up some of the text. My apologies. This is going to be a network of elastic fibers, and they're going to be more densely packed together, these lacunae and the chondrocytes, compared to hyaline cartilage. Also, the way that they're usually stained is a little bit darker, but don't always go on color. But they have strength and elasticity. You're going to find this type of cartilage in the external ear, so this part right here, and in the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is going to be in your throat. It's going to be what opens and closes to allow for food or air to pass through the correct tube. So if you're laughing and eating or drinking at the same time, chances are that epiglottis is going to move too much because you're speaking or laughing or whatever, as well as trying to swallow food or drink, and that is going to cause you to choke because something's going to go down the wrong pipe, and that's what happens. So what's interesting about elastic cartilage, specifically with the ear, is if you have ever been into wrestling, there's something called cauliflower ear, which is where damage is done to the external ear, and because, remember, there's no good blood supply going to this cartilage, it causes that cartilage to swell and then scar very easily. So you'll get this puffy looking ear that kind of looks like cauliflower, and that's a pretty common thing to see in wrestlers. Next up and last of our cartilage is fibrocartilage. These are going to be collagen fiber bundles. They are for strength and shock absorption. You'll find these in the intervertebral discs, so the little bits of soft cartilage tissue between your vertebrae. The pubic symphysis, which is going to be a structure that makes up the front part of your pelvis, and we'll talk about that later, as well as your menisci, which are going to be your knees. So it makes sense that that is a shock absorber there. When you wear out your meniscus of either leg or both, then it's gone kind of forever. So you might need some type of surgery if this should disappear. But you can see how these structures lay together kind of in a nice little line here. So that is the collagen fibers within the matrix, and you can see still these lacunae with their chondrocytes in the middle. Last but not least, for our connective tissue, the last supporting connective tissue is bone. I think it is the most distinct looking type of tissue. You'll find this in the skeletal system. They're going to contain cells called osteocytes, which is just bone cells that are going to be located in the lacunae as well. So these are also going to have lacunae. So the lacunae are going to be these little structures here, little darker structures. And then the osteocyte is going to be in the middle of those lacunae. Now, what's interesting is that in the middle here, this is where we're going to have blood supply to these cells. So this is going to be a artery or a vein, sometimes both together, usually, as you can see down here. And we will talk about this a little bit more in depth when we get to the skeletal system, which will be right after our first exam. From here, you're going to see that we have these concentric circles, and then all of this together is a lamellae. So this term. Next up, in a shorter section of our types of tissues, is going to be your muscle tissue. These are going to contract and help the body move. There are three types of muscle tissue, pardon me. You have smooth muscle tissue, which you're going to find in the digestive tract, cardiac muscle tissue, which is going to make up your heart, and skeletal muscle tissue, which is going to be pretty much any muscle that you can think of in your body that you control. So smooth muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue you cannot control, which is a term called involuntary, while I know I'm blocking this, but this says voluntary. Skeletal muscle tissue is voluntary. You control it. Like right here, right now, I'm using my deltoid as well as a few other muscles to lift up my arm. My deltoid is that big muscle that's on my shoulder. So first up we have our smooth muscle tissue, which is going to kind of look like bacon in a way. To me, it kind of always has this sort of flow to it. It is going to be within your internal organs, so your digestive system is the big one that I think of, and you're also going to have smooth muscle tissue make up your blood vessels. Next we have cardiac, which is going to make up your heart, and it has a very distinct structure in it, and I want to make sure that you know it. That is intercalated discs. These are these little lines. What these lines do is make sure that all of the cells in cardiac tissue are nice and coordinated. So it is fast connection, communication, and coordination. Is what they serve the purpose of. And do know that your heart is involuntary muscle tissue. You do not control it. If you had to think about it on a daily basis, that would be insane. And then something kind of interesting, these long structures here, that is mitochondria. Kind of cool. And then we have muscle tissue, the last one, which is skeletal muscle tissue. These are going to be the voluntary types of muscle tissue. They are attached to bone. They can undergo hypertrophy and atrophy. So atrophy is going to be the degradation of muscles, and hypertrophy is going to be kind of the building up of muscles. So when you work out excessively, and I don't know, maybe it's always arm day or back day or leg day for you, and you build up those muscles in those limbs or those various parts of your body, that is hypertrophy. If you become bedbound and you cannot get up for a while, you can undergo something called atrophy, which means that the muscles will kind of disintegrate and become smaller. Now the thing that I want you to pay attention to is that these are nice and striated, but there's no intercalated discs. So just look for those when you're looking at cardiac versus skeletal muscle tissue. Last and certainly not least, we have nervous tissue, and there's only one slide I want you to know for a fact, and that is this nice little neuron. This is a neuron. You're going to find this in your brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Typically, this is kind of the makeup of a neuron. We are going to talk about them a little bit more later, but they're going to have these little structures coming off of the cell body. This can also be called the soma. We have the nucleus here in the middle. Put a little in there. But we have dendrites coming off of here, which are going to have information coming in to the cell, and then the axon, which is going to be the structure that has information going out of the cell. So info comes in through the dendrites, gets processed in some capacity very quickly, and then sent out through the axon. You have these smaller cells down here and all about, which are called neuroglia. These are supporting cells. What these cells do is supply whatever the neurons need, whether it's nutrients or some type of repair, whatever it may be. Okay, so that covers all of the types of tissues that I want you to know, as well as their functions, their locations, their purposes, what they look like. So make sure that you know from these notes what each type of tissue looks like. And that should do it.